Give it just a few more minutes here because we want to make sure that we don't jump the gun on a start time here for some people that are just joining us. But it's really been pretty exciting here. This is kind of the debut episode, if you will, of season one of Science for Success, and to have over 200 people register is just fantastic. And we really hope you take a lot from the show today. And obviously, we've got a great lineup, and we just really appreciate all the people that joined early too, because that just helps to make things move smoother for Todd, and with all the technical things that he has to do. We got a question here. Hi, from Carrie. My name is Russ Brandis from Hancock, Iowa. I have an ancestor with that same name and wondered if we are related somehow. I can't help you there, but Russ and Carrie, there you go. You can have your little chat and we'll figure that out. And who knows, maybe I'll find out before the end of the show that I'm related to somebody. So you never know. It's a small world in agriculture.
I think it's an Iowa thing.
You do? Well, there you go. There you go. I am just pulling up one more thing here so that I am ready, and we'll give it about 2 more minutes here, and then we'll get started. So great to see that the chat is working, and that is something that I'll mention for all of you that have already joined. That you can put your questions on chat along the way, and then after each presentation, we're going to take a little time, for you to direct those questions or get those questions answered from either Rachel, Seth, or Sean. And I'll read your question to make sure that everybody can hear it, and that's how we'll do that. And we really do want to have a lot of questions throughout this. I was told that we really don't have a hard stop at noon, so we're going to kind of go with the flow here and make sure that this is a good discussion. It's a good dialogue. It's why you do these things. You get some information, you get behind the science, and if you're curious like me, you have questions and you want to know the why behind it. So really encourage people to do that. Got another question about CCA credits being offered. Yes, they are. And there's 2 ways that you're going to be able to get credit for this. The first is at the last presentation, and this will be on the last slide that Dr. Sean Conway has. We'll have a QR code that you can scan with the reader. If you don't want to do that, you can just enter your CCA number in the chat here, and we'll be able to capture that and make sure that you get credit that way, through that approach. So whatever is easiest for everybody, that's how we're going to do it. And John's going to be handling that for us. And John just sent a message. I should have just been quiet and let y'all read John's message, because he did it much more efficiently than I did. All right, well, I think we're going to get started here, and I think we're ready to go. And so I just want to welcome everybody and say a big thank you for joining us, and welcome to Science for Success. Science for Success is really the best management practices by extension researchers from across the United States. That's really what Science for Success is all about. And it's made possible with funding from the Soybean Checkoff. I'm Max Wenk. I'm a soybean farmer, and I'm going to be your host for today. This is the first of what we hope will be, many Science for Success programs that you can look forward to. Today's program is going to focus on the best practices that checkoff funded research found for soybean row spacing, plant population, and planting date. And to tell us all about those practices, we have a panel of 3 university experts, and they had hands-on involvement with this research, and we're joined in that research effort with 12 other university extension colleagues. And I hope you are all on this Zoom as well. But joining us on the panel today, first, Dr. Rachel Vann. Rachel is the soybean extension specialist at North Carolina State University. We have Seth Nave, who is the soybean extension agronomist at the University of Minnesota. And then we have Dr. Sean Connolly, who is a soybean and small grains extension specialist at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And a little bit about our format for today. We're going to answer your questions after each presentation and any final questions at the very end with the time remaining. So please use the chat box to type in your questions at any time. And then we've talked, I think, about the QR code, but for anybody that just joined us, at the end of Sean's presentation, which will be the last one, there'll be a code and you can use the reader to scan that, or you can type your CCA number in the chat, and then we'll be able to capture your number that way and make sure that you get the credit. So without further ado, Dr. Vann, we're going to lead off with you, but before you take us through what you shared about soybean row spacing, tell us a little bit about Science for Success.
Sounds great. Thank you for the introduction, Max, and delighted to be here with everybody this afternoon to talk about our new Science for Success initiative and some of the recent extension material that we've summarized. So I want to give you an overview of Science for Success. And this is a team of soybean agronomists at land-grant institutions across the U.S. who are really focused on delivering best management practices to soybean farmers across the nation. And to do this, we are going to summarize existing and ongoing state-supported soybean checkoff research and really make sure that we're working together as a team to amplify that state level knowledge into national extension impact while maintaining important regional considerations. So to do this, we have a team of soybean agronomists from across the United States that's worked together on the topics that we're going to discuss today. But really, any soybean extension specialist or agronomist that's working at a land-grant institution is welcome to join our team and work on these efforts. So to highlight some of the value of this initiative, for example, a topic that we get a lot of questions about from our growers is the value of foliar fertilization. So as a national team in 2019 and 2020, we worked on some collaborative research trials looking at the value of foliar fertilizers. And we were able to quickly capture over 2 years, 46 sites across the US where we were able to conduct a common research protocol so that we can deliver best management practices based on this research and beyond that we've done in our various states. Another example of this collaborative research is a trial focused on sulfur and nitrogen applications at soybean planting that we've been doing over the past couple of years. And we've been able to run that research at 43 sites across various states, capturing many different tillage and soil type environments. And we've had a graduate student, Emma Matcham at the University of Wisconsin, helping us summarize that information so we can develop these best management practices. We've got future collaborative research topics focused on delivering best management practices for soil health and nitrogen fixation in the upcoming years. And these topics will evolve as needed to provide relevant information out to soybean farmers across the US on these various best management practices. And to deliver this information out to our clientele, we are using the Soybean Research and Information Network, as well as our local extension channels to distribute extension publications, production videos, and things like this webinar on those various topics. So look out for this information coming out annually, depending on what best management practices our team is addressing. So with this being a relatively new initiative at this point in our project, we haven't had the field time yet to effectively summarize some of our collaborative research. So in 2020, what we did was focus on topics where we already had existing knowledge at our state level funded research trials over many years. And so these topics that we focused on in 2020 were planting considerations related to row spacing, plant population, and planting date. And those are the topics that you'll hear from our team today. So that was an overview of our project initiative. We're excited to be getting the Science for Success program kicked off officially with this webinar today.
That sounds great, Rachel. So why don't we move right into the first presentation, and that's you on row spacing.
Sounds great, Max. So the first topic that our collaborative team addressed was soybean row spacing. And what we know is that farmers across the US can successfully produce soybeans on a wide range of row spacing, all the way from drilled out to very wide rows, which might be used in the South, depending on rotational complexity. And often these row spacing decisions are driven by equipment availability and, again, rotational complexity. You know, some of our wider rows are experienced with growers that might have cotton or peanuts in their rotation. But if we look at our data from across the nation, which row spacing is best? So in this initiative, we looked at state checkoff funded research from 84 small plot row spacing trials. And what we found was, on average, a 15 versus 30-inch row across all these sites provided about a 3.5 bushel per acre yield advantage. Now, if you look at this figure, on the x-axis, we have yield advantage from narrow versus wide row spacing. And you can see about 30% of the time, the yield advantage from narrow versus wider row spacing was less than 1 bushel per acre, so very minimal to no advantage. But the majority of the time, we saw about a 1 to 4 bushel per acre advantage, and sometimes we saw a much more pronounced advantage than that. On the sites where we were able to look at row spacing between drilled versus 15-inch row spacing, those two row spacings typically performed comparably for yield. And what is driving that narrow row yield advantage? Well, when we plant in narrow rows, typically we're getting to canopy closure more quickly, allowing us to maximize light interception to drive photosynthesis. There's additional benefits beyond maximizing photosynthesis, which include faster canopy closure, increasing the crop competitiveness with weeds, which is only going to become increasingly important as we're trying to manage these herbicide-resistant weeds. And also, the quicker we get to canopy closure, the less opportunity there is for sunlight to drive moisture out of the soil. These benefits from narrow rows are typically more pronounced when the time from vegetative emergence, so when the soybeans emerge, to R3, our pod set, is shortened. And that might be shortened due to late planting or the use of an earlier maturing variety, especially in a late planting situation. But we also want to acknowledge that yield environment plays into the benefits of various row spacing, and recent producer-derived data from both the Midwest and the Southeast would indicate that in high yield situations, our growers often have flexibility for using a wide range of row spacing without compromising yield. And that's typically because in our higher yield environments, other optimum production practices are used, like earlier planting dates, which will ensure faster canopy closure, effective weed management, or fields that have low weed pressure in the first place, and not a lot of soil moisture limitation. So an important part of this initiative, as we try to summarize these best management practices across the nation, is that we're also talking about important regional considerations. So A couple of those related to row spacing might be in circumstances where there's white mold in the north. Previous research has indicated that wider row spacing can sometimes reduce the incidence of that disease, but that doesn't necessarily translate into higher yields based on narrow rows for the aforementioned benefits. Sometimes our farmers in the south might be using a wider row spacing in their soybean, where they're running a subsoil shank under the row to try to break a hard pan. And we have a lot of growers that tell us that in those circumstances, especially on sandy soils, their wider row beans out yield their narrow row beans. And we also want to acknowledge that in the south, where double cropping or planting soybeans behind wheat is more common, we typically see a much more pronounced benefit of narrow rows in a double crop situation, simply because we've shortened that VE to R3 period, and we can get the beans to canopy closure more quickly in narrow rows. So this is some research done by some colleagues across the US several years ago, sort of summarizing yield response from narrow to wide row spacing across the US. So these different colored circles represent yield response, where red is negative yield response from narrow to wide rows, all the way down to blue, which is a very positive yield response. So if we start by looking at the states in the south, like North Carolina, Arkansas, Tennessee, you typically see that we do see a considerable yield advantage from narrow versus wider rows. North Carolina, you can really see there, for example, we see quite a positive yield response from narrow rows. As you move up into the Midwest, we often do still see a benefit of narrow rows, but not always, and that benefit is typically less pronounced than in our southern environments. So some key takeaways from this soybean summary is really soybeans can be grown successfully on a wide range of row spacing. If you look at our small plot data summarized across the nation, about 70% of the time, our narrow rows out yield our wider rows. And this is driven by earlier canopy closure, maximizing photosynthesis, minimizing weed pressure, minimizing soil moisture loss. But we also want to emphasize that based on some recent producer-derived data, our growers do have flexibility on row spacing in high yield environments. So those were the high points we wanted to cover on our summary of row spacing. And before we move into the next topic, hopefully there's a couple questions.
And yes, we do, Rachel. We have a couple. We've got a question about what is the most common row spacing used and why? And then we had a comment that it could be 10 inches. So I'll let you respond to that.
So I would say that the answer to that question is highly dependent upon your region within the United States, and we're representing quite a wide range of states here, so it varies across our team. In North Carolina, I think historically soybeans were planted on wider row or drilled row spacing, but we have a lot of shift towards narrower row spacing use in our state, 15 versus 20 inches. But Sean or Seth should weigh in. I know they've done some recent pretty large surveys of growers in the Midwest on used row spacing and can answer that better for that region.
I'll just jump in real quick. I would say I would agree that it's all regional, but one of the more interesting phenomena that we've seen in the last 10 years is a real increase in planters over drills or air seeders or things like this. So, and planter size has really increased. So in the far north, where we had lots of 20s and 22-inch rows, some of these farmers, as they want to push larger and larger planters, they're moving away from 20s and 22s into 30-inch rows. So we've seen some movement actually back from very narrow rows or narrow 15s to 22s, all the way back to 30s in some cases. So I consider this a reversion from probably one of our best management practices.
We have another question. Did anyone look at twin row soybeans when you guys did your review?
that was not a topic that came up in our review. I'm sure some of our team members have looked more specifically at twin row spacing versus other row spacings, but not something that we've looked at very robustly recently in North Carolina. But maybe some of our other team members have looked at that and want to make a comment.
Seth or Sean?
I'll jump in here. What we've really seen is those twin rows align pretty closely with what the 20 inch and 15 inch row spacings would yield in a given area. So again, that's the data that I've seen. Seth, do you have anything to add?
I would just say we get just a partial benefit if we're on 30s, and twin 30s give us just a little bit benefit. They don't get us all the way to 20 or 15, but they do a little bit. My feeling is that they don't give us quite as much in the soybean side as we get on corn, just because of the way we're metering that crop out and the plant to plant distance that we have in soybean versus corn.
And we have two questions here, and they're along the same topic. And actually, it was a question that I wanted to ask too. The first was, and let me get my chat back because it just moved. When comparing row spacing, was the planting population the same for each spacing or higher populations and in narrower rows? And then the other question was, does row spacing help to determine plant population? So Seth, I know you're going to be talking about plant population, but maybe you and Rachel could tag team, and Sean as well, on these questions regarding plant population and interaction with row spacing.
Well, believe it or not, I have a strong opinion on this particular question. And what we've seen, we've followed a lot of plants, through the crop and looked at attrition in or dying out of those plants in these systems. And what we've identified makes total sense is in wide rows, we tend to have greater attrition. So there's more self-thinning. So our final stands in wider rows tend to be lower on a percentage basis than we have in narrow rows. So we have more survivors in narrow rows. And I think it goes back, it really supports, this argument that, we've had as agronomists about narrow rows versus wide rows and interactions for populations. And in the end, I think we were all correct in that narrow rows probably require higher seeding rates or higher final stands at the end of the season, but they get there actually quite naturally through self or less self-thinning, I would say. So I think for the most part, I think the planting rate studies have shown that we don't have a lot of interaction between seeding rate and row spacing because of that self-thinning fact. But I know in Wisconsin they've had a different recommendation for years, so maybe Sean wants to chime in on this one.
Some of the data that we've looked at, we have a hard time, picking up that row spacing by seeding rate interaction. That it tends to not be evident in many trials. And again, a certain percentage, yes, we will see something maybe on some of the lower yielding fields where we physically need more plants out there. But even I would target these high yield environments. I don't think we see any interaction, as Seth had indicated by his self-thinning observations.
We have another question. What were the results coming out of 7-inch row spacing? And I know in Ohio there was some specific things to look at. So.
Yeah, so probably the most robust data we looked at here came from our colleague, Dr. Laura Lindsay out of Ohio State, where they looked at some 7 versus 15-inch row spacing somewhat recently. And typically they were finding in those trials that the 7 and 15-inch row spacing was yielding comparably. Of course, in the 7-inch row spacing, sometimes we can experience lodging issues depending on fertility environment, which may lead to some small yield declines later in the season. But that's really who contributed our strongest data on that topic was out of Ohio State.
And another question here in regard to seed spacing. Any thoughts on the importance of seed spacing in regards to different row spacing? For example, is plant spacing more influential as we narrow the rows? Who wants
Okay,
to tackle that one?
Yeah, I'll go first, then Sean wants to get in. So,
Okay.
you know, following my same line of thinking on the attrition side. My feeling is that when we've looked at seed emergence, the better
No way.
distributed in the furrow those soybeans are, the greater the emergence percentage. So basically what we're talking about with distribution is simply a change in the overall the emergence patterns of those. Sorry, that's not on my end.
So we just finished up a couple of years of research here in Wisconsin, looking at the specific question where we're looking at a precision planter versus just more like a random drop. And really what we didn't really see any yield difference between a precision planter and a random drop. And this one was focused on 30-inch rows because that's what the equipment we had available. We didn't see any break until we got under 70,000, seeds per acre drop before we could sort out any difference between precision and random drop. And again, I think it goes back to some of the work that we did earlier as agronomists, this decade study, where we had soybean germplasm from roughly 1924 all the way up to 2014. And what we find is today's modern genetics put 3 times the amount of yield on these branches. They branch pretty heavily and add a lot of yield to those branches. So really kind of overcomes this thought about needing that picket fence out there, just because we've effectively changed the physiology of these soybean plants a little bit. So again, I don't really see that on the soybean side that we may see on corn. And Seth, Rachel, if you guys want to comment.
The only thing I'd round this out with is I think the overall, I think the summary of that question is that precision planters in my mind don't gain us yield. They allow us to save on seed. So you really have to, a farmer has to pencil it out based on seed savings rather than trying to estimate yield improvements relative, because basically a farmer can just overseed. If they have poor distribution in the furrow, they can just overseed those and overcome any of those potential deficits.
And I'm going to just give, we got just a couple more questions here, and then we probably need to move on with you, Seth. And we were just talking about seed singulation. The question, does seed singulation become...
The road is blocked up there.
Does seed singulation become more important at higher populations? And is there a plant spacing where attrition occurs?
I know, Seth, you and your graduate students done more work than our program recently on that.
It's basically a linear function here. So if you have 1 and 2, and if you have 2 or 3 seeds that fall in the furrow right next to each other, typically we get 1 or 2 of those emerge. And so the greater the amount or the worse distribution that we have in the furrow, the more of a problem we have, and we have more loss. So there's no real hard and firm line of every soybean within a ½ inch of another soybean is dead. I don't think that's really the case. Obviously, it's going to depend on conditions later on as well. So, but I think just in general, there's definitely the poorer the distribution, the more attrition we have.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Rachel, for your comments on row spacing. And we're going to move now to you, Dr. Nave, and you're going to share what you found regarding plant population and how that impacts optimal seeding rates.
Okay, are y'all with me? Are we on?
Yep,
yes, Seth Nave here again, soybean extension specialist from Minnesota. And I am going to talk about soybean population. And I'm really going to hit actually the very highest of high points in this presentation. There's a lot of nuances as all those questions really brought up. I mean, those were really the right questions that we all had as a group as we worked on this soybean population paper. And the question, our issue was really what to pull out of this paper, because we could really only include the very highest level points within it. And in fact, this presentation is only the top level pieces within what's published there. And so I do encourage everybody to go and download those 3 PDFs that we have for these 3 presentations, and you can get a lot more details from those. So just very briefly, a little bit of a distribution of soybean populations that we see around the country. So this is a graphical distribution or a pictorial distribution of populations that Sean and his group identified through surveys over several years on a North Central Soybean Research Program funded project. You can see that we have a lot of range in terms of populations that farmers are planting for primarily environmental differences and purposes. You can see Kansas, we've got some lower populations. And then as we move further north, definitely planting at higher seeding rates. My own experience in Minnesota doing surveys and plant stand counts out in fields, we find this much and much more variation even within counties and even townships. Farmer to farmer variation in the amount of seed that they drop is huge. And I really think it's related to this, this question about how they their level of risk that they're willing to take within their operation. And at first I was really dismayed by this because I couldn't understand that why farmers weren't targeting very specific populations. But as we got more and more into doing the agronomy behind this, we understood that the yield responses are really relatively flat for soybean populations, and that we actually get a little bit of yield back, a little bit of yield stability back at those higher seeding rates. And so it tends to really even things out. And so that's going to come around towards the end of this presentation. We're going to pull back to that. So again, some very high level issues here. So this is a soybean plant planted at a very low seeding rate. This is exactly what all of you farmers see out in those fields. Anytime you have a plant that ends up being on its own island, branches out heavily. Soybeans branch, they typically initiate branching at V1 or V2 up to V3. So soybean recognizes all of its neighbors very, very early, puts out branches and initiates those branches at the very early point in its growth stage. And so it actually senses its environment very quickly. So it responds to that. And soybean's very unique in that is very elastic to its environment. And in fact, what's even better about soybean as a crop is that elasticity doesn't really come at any fitness cost or any cost to the yield of that soybean plant. A soybean plant that produces more branches and more yield on those more leaves and then more yield on those branches tends not to have come at any additional cost to that overall canopy. In other words, we don't tend to lose yield simply because that plant had to put out those additional branches. That branching didn't necessarily cost that plant any extra. It's much different than we're dealing with corn that has to put on another ear, or if it fails to fill that ear completely, then that's a lost investment in terms of that cob and shuck. So we have a very different kind of a system here, and that really, I think, from the very beginning allows us to produce a very different kind of a response. So at higher seeding rates, this is the kind of thing that we see in these fields. This is the same linear area of a row as I showed in that previous slide, but this is a higher seeding rate. You can see those plants are just distributed more broadly than the others. So it distributes both the yield and leaf area first, and yield throughout a larger area. This is really, I think, we could probably spend half an hour just discussing this figure. I think this really, shows the principles of row spacing, or population, excuse me, best. And what we've got here is shown 4 row space, or 4 populations from 25 up to 275,000. So this illustrates a couple points. One is, I would say that slide 1 or figure A within the upper left-hand corner, you can see a very deficient populations. You can imagine this late June, mid to late June figure. Those soybeans are unlikely to really develop a full lush canopy anywhere in the Corn Belt to the northern Corn Belt during the season. There's going to be gaps. We're going to have soil showing through the season. Any kind of soil that's exposed, anytime we do not have full 100% light interception by our crop, means that we're missing out on some yield potential within those fields. Therefore, we're not capturing the total amount of light. We're not transferring that into seed yield. We're not getting the yields that we should have. When we get to B at 125,000, you can see those, you can imagine that those 20-inch rows are going to canopy quite nicely in a week or so. The issue here, though, is that we've maybe missed a few days where we don't have full canopy closure. You can imagine farmers from, the middle of the I-states through Minnesota, Wisconsin, and the Dakotas into Michigan and on the upper eastern seaboard. In those areas where our seasons are so short, that can cost us some yield potential because total light interception is has more of an impact on overall yield than further south in the US. As we move into those 225 and 275s, those populations canopied earlier, covered the rows quicker, and had full light interception earlier in the season, and have a potential to maximize yields based on light interception relative to B or C. So we talk a lot about seeding rate and population density. And so this is one of the things that I want to caution all the growers out there is that academics are going to throw around seeding rates and populations and population densities. And so it's very important for us to understand what those definitions are. From a physiological and a yield establishment standpoint, it's important to think about that population density during the season. And we want to have 100,000 to 125,000 plants per acre mid-season to the end of the year in order to maximize yields throughout the middle part of the Corn Belt. And as we get into North Dakota, Northwest Minnesota, we may need up to 150,000 in those tougher areas with very short seasons. And in the South, 100,000 might get us there. So the real question, I guess, for growers is when it really boils down to brass tacks on this question, it's really about economic response. So where is the economic response for soybean relative to populations? And so I'd just like to walk through this just really briefly. And I don't have the base data here, but we use North Dakota yield response data because it was really very typical of what many of us saw around the upper Midwest for yield responses in soybean. Basically, we get to 125,000 plants per acre in the field and don't see any real significant yield increase from there on. However, we have a little bit greater yield stability at higher and higher populations so that we can get an extra bushel or two when we look at a lot of locations. My feeling is that is probably response or is a reasonable a picture that we see within individual fields, even where we have variations in soil types within fields or within farms. What we've shown here is three different costs of seeds. So this is partial, basically a net partial profit based on seeding rate and based on cost of seed. So the green shows maybe a non-GM soybean variety that could be purchased off the shelf or a Roundup One variety. Otherwise, we're looking at $51 and $58 soybeans in the red and the blue. And on the left, and I'm sorry this wasn't in the figure, but those are $8 soybeans at grain it's sold at the end. And on the right, we're looking at $10 soybeans at the end of the year. So it gives you a little bit of a flavor what kind of a economic yield response we get for various seeding rates relative to the cost of the seed versus the cost of the grain at the end. So thinking about current situation, if you wanted to consider $12 and $14 soybeans, you could basically just amplify that trend that we see from the left to the right. And you can see that we tip those curves up significantly. But a couple of key points I really wanted to make here is that yes, seed cost does have some small effect, but if we're all dealing with traded seed in that $45 to $55 range, we're probably not going to see much effect on the economic response. We're also, I want you to note that in this populations between 80 and 140,000 plants per acre seeds dropped, we're really not affecting overall returns to any great extent at all. We have to push through those quite high populations before we really tip this thing up or down. So it allows growers a lot of flexibility in terms of their seeding rates. And I think it tells us a lot about why we see such wide ranges in seeding rates out there, is because farmers have noticed this and noticed that if they want to be more conservative in terms of maximizing the amount of seed that they have to put more seed down and be sure that they have plenty of seed dropped. Otherwise, if they want to be very conservative on their cost up front and maybe willing to give up half a bushel at the end of the year on average, then they can pull back those seeding rates. So the question really is about determining what's the seeding rate based on this desired plant stand. And this all varies tremendously based on region, based on planters, based on tillage and residue, rotations. Everything that we do has an impact on this. But a rough estimate is that we need to drop 25% extra seed than we need in order to maximize those stands. So through the Midwest, if we want to ensure that we absolutely have 100,000 plants per acre at the end of the year, we need to be sure to drop at least 125,000. So again, just some key takeaways here. Soybeans are going to adapt to the environment. We recommend 125 to 150 throughout the north and 100,000 plants per acre in the southern U.S. And we need to really increase, again, as I mentioned, target seeding rates by about 25% relative to the others. So I know I'm going to preempt questions on white mold and things like iron chlorosis. Those are very, very important interactions that we get. We'd be happy to discuss those, but we certainly didn't bring those into the baseline of this discussion. But those are very, very important critical pieces that go into managing populations on farms.
Dr. Nave, thank you for those highlights. And indeed, they were highlights. So much we can talk about. And we've got a question here. The question, Seth, is do you vary seeding rates according to tillage practices in your respective areas? So maybe you can kind of speak to that.
I would say that's probably one of the first things that a lot of us agronomists would probably agree that that's the first easy one to probably to look at interactions with, and that we do note high residue. There's a number of reasons where extra residue, especially following corn, we need a little extra seed out there. There's emergence problems because of physical planting problems, as well as physical and water and temperature related things after planting. And so we definitely have to crank up populations based on residue. But there's also conditions with very, very clean soils and crusting and issues like this that we have to really monitor our seeding rates on the other side of this as well. So this is really it's a perfect example of customizing management based on that individual farmer's individual situation, I guess you'd say.
And another question here, and I think all three of you may want to weigh in on this. The question is, shouldn't seeding rate recommendations be dependent upon row spacing and planting date? So a number of variables there. What's your thoughts?
So I'll speak a little bit to that from the South and just say from our perspective, of course, what was not captured when we said we would recommend 100,000 seeds per acre in the South, that would be for a full season situation typically. As we delay planting date in our region, especially when we get into a double crop situation, we would recommend that our growers increase their seeding rates quite considerably out into a double crop situation for some of the reasons that Seth articulated earlier. So planting date definitely has an influence, as does row spacing, as Seth has talked to earlier. But I will say, out of the Southeast, some recent analysis we've done in high yielding situations based on this productivity of the soil component of that question, we are typically seeing more of a yield response to lower populations in a full season situation, more positive yield response in our environment in some of our higher yielding situations.
Seth or Sean, anything you want to add?
I mean, we would see a similar response here in Wisconsin. We would see that generally over as we delay planting, we need to increase our seeding rate. Usually what we tend to see is if like Seth had mentioned earlier, about 100,000 would maximize yield on probably 70 to 80% of our soils here in Wisconsin. But then as we get later and later, we push that up to maybe needing 130, 140,000 in these late planted situations on the highly productive soil, and a little bit higher up to that 180,000, as we get into June, into some of these lower productivity soils. So again, very similar type of a response we see that what Rachel sees in the South.
Seth?
I just temper that with a little bit of the research results, and I totally agree. And in theory that these delayed plantings, really, we need to crank up our seeding rate to maximize those canopies. We don't always see that, and I think looking back at the data and understanding and thinking about the environments that we're in, when we plant later in the north, we tend to have better stands relative to those very early seeding rates. So we don't see as much of a yield. We don't reduce that yield loss as much as we might expect with increased seeding rates later, simply because we have better emergence, better emergence later than we normally would. But otherwise, I totally agree with the comments of the other ones.
Another question here, Seth, should seeding rates change based on the more higher productive soils versus the more stressed soils? And oftentimes you can have both in the same field. So what's your thoughts?
Yeah, so I think that's a field we've done some work on, and some others here have done some work on variable rate seeding, and we've confirmed what a lot of consultants and some of the farmers have found is that basically we're dealing with the reverse of corn, where higher productivity soils, we can actually reduce seeding rates a little bit relative to the lower, least less productive soils. And I think for the most part, you can think about those canopies. We need to form a big early canopy in those areas. And so some of those lighter soils, some of those soils, we have a little bit more trouble maximizing yields. Extra seed out there tends to help us a little bit more than on the other side. And then, I mentioned white mold on the other side of this, and I think we do have more disease, more white mold, and things like that, where we do have highly productive soils, where we just have bigger canopies, and we can let those high populations actually can be more detrimental on those higher productivity soils than they can on lower productivity soils.
Got it. Here's another question. Is there any data yet on the economic return of using that high seeding rate? In other words, you referenced dropping 25% more than your target plant population and harvest. The economic return of that.
So part of a large USB trial that we were part of several years ago, 60 site years of data where we had a huge range. We put the economics to that, and it confirmed some of those things that we talked about here earlier, is that we could, the economic response curve was flat between about 115 and 185,000 plants per acre. So huge, broad range. And again, my personal belief is that high end yield response is simply due to this yield stability. And I think that yield stability goes to speak within fields as well. So if we've got an 80-acre field, if we're planting dropping 175,000 plants per acre or seeds per acre, we can ensure that every one of those acres is going to have enough seed to maximize yield. And I think that's where we're at. It's not like every individual acre is gaining a half a bushel when we move from 140 to 175,000. It's just that we've got a couple acres within fields that might get a couple, 2 or 3 bushels on top. So it's a risk management situation in my mind, and I think again, more of this variable rate seeding data. I think we're going to bring out some more of that information out.
And here's another good question. So you can select different plant types, right? Bushy versus thin. Is there any interaction regarding the plant type with population or row spacing that you guys have seen?
So we did some work geez, it's probably a decade ago now looking at this. And frankly, we didn't see any difference between what I could, characterize as a bush type bean versus an erect stem bean. And again, I would attribute that to the fact that, most plant breeders, soybean breeders, are doing their advances on 30-inch rows. And if an erect bean doesn't bush or yield in a 30-inch row, then it's not going to move on. So that's my thoughts on this. And Seth, Rachel, I don't know what you've all seen, if you've dug into that at all.
Yeah, no interactions, big marketing campaigns based on this, just because seed salesmen need to have something to talk about. Soybeans are really so similar, and the genetics between these, we just do not have the diversity out there in soybean. Agronomists like us are constantly looking for interactions by these varieties, and we just do not see any of these management by variety interactions that a lot of people like to talk about.
Seth, here, another question. I think this is an easy one. Just want clarification that on your takeaway summary slide, where you were recommending plant population, the question is that the final harvest population, or is that the actual plant population set for spring? So when you were recommending, in the north and in the south.
It's a very good question, and I guess we're trying to keep everybody happy here, and I think those recommendations were based on final plants. 150 in the far north, 125 through the central, and 100 or lower in the southern U.S. I think captures final stands pretty well. But again, I just can't emphasize enough that there's a lot of room on both sides of this. People can be very successful growing soybeans on either side of those recommendations. And I don't know that there's a wrong answer, but again, I think the risk management side of it is really important, and farmers really have to consider how much risk they're willing to take in terms of those populations.
Yeah, that's a great point, Seth. And here's another good question. And Sean, this might get into some of what you're about to talk about, but is there some relationship between seed population and soil temperature? And that becomes a consideration when we try to move that soybean planting date up earlier in some no-till situations. So.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, by default, if we remember when a lot of this initial work was done on how many GDUs does it take to get corn and soybeans out of the ground, that was done in the 60s and 70s when we planted beans in June. And by default, we just went with a base 50-degree Fahrenheit soil temperature for soybean, just because, well, it is what it's for corn, so let's just stick with it with soybean. And I think there's some evidence out there to suggest that base temperature is less than corn. I've seen it cited at 48 degrees Fahrenheit. I've seen it at 46 in some of these different models. But again, one of the things we really look at is kind of trying to look out 48 hours past when you're going to plant. I know weather predictions are not always accurate, but we can get, some inhibitional chilling with soybean as you do in corn. So if you kind of look at that 48-hour stretch, and usually what I tell farmers in Wisconsin and what we see is if it's 45 degrees Fahrenheit on the soil temperature and you're looking outward and there's no cold rain coming for 2 days, I tell farmers let her rip. So that's kind of what our experience is up here in Wisconsin, what we tend to see. So Seth, I'll make you comment because I don't think the soils even freeze down there, do they, Rachel?
Here's another question, and I don't know if this is something that you also took a look at as you were reviewing all the data that you published, but what is the recommended ratio of potash to DAP, okay, for soybean development? Do you have any guidance on that, any rule of thumb?
Whatever Kerry Lebowski, my soil fertility specialist, says in 82809, that's what I go by, because otherwise I will get in trouble.
Got it. Any thoughts on relative day length, planting date, and impact on yield? And I know that becomes a consideration as you get into a shorter season in some parts of the country.
Can you repeat that for us? I'm sorry, I didn't.
Yeah, so looking for any thoughts on relative day length and planting date and the impact on yield. So another way to think about it, you know, if you've got a shorter season versus a longer season, is there any difference regarding planting date that you should be looking at?
That's a Sean question for sure.
So, yeah, it's an interesting thing because if we look at what's going on again with breeders have effectively changed, you know, a little bit of the physiology of soybean plants over the last 30 years. And again, this is reflective of some of that work that we did with this group of plant breeders. And what we found is today's soybeans actually, on average, in Wisconsin and the I states, they will flower about a week earlier than they did, say, 30 years ago. And then what we've really seen is then we add somewhere between 7 to 10 days in, you know, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and 10 to 14 days in the I states and South in terms of that reproductive growth phase is 10 to 14 days longer in those areas. So again, we swapped up some vegetative versus reproductive timeframes. And one of the cool things we've noticed is if we plant early enough in the north and the photoperiod dependency, we can actually trigger flowering ahead of that, you know, the summer solstice. So we've have, you know, farmers in Wisconsin, we can get flowers in that first week of June. And I've seen that on Twitter with some of the March planted beans across the I states, that we can get those flowers, you know, occur earlier just based on when we can initiate that flowering. So I can drop something in the chat if you want to get deeper into that. Seth, Rachel, you guys, any thoughts on this?
I would just add that in addition to the data set on this out of the Midwest and some of the other states, we're starting to do a lot more work in our region on the importance of planting earlier. And we are typically seeing higher yields associated with planting our soybeans earlier than we have historically have, which, you know, in North Carolina, a lot have been planted in June historically, and we're largely attributing the yield benefit from these earlier planting dates to capitalizing on some of these longer days of the year. So we're seeing similar phenomenons down here in the South.
And I'll just throw out one kind of, you know, academic point to this is that, you know, in the far north where we're at here in Minnesota and in the Dakotas, we grow a lot of soybeans all the way along the Canadian border. So one could imagine that if we could get a crop going up and early and canopied by the time we hit the summer solstice, I mean, we've got 16-hour days. And so there's a real potential. So that's really in terms of maximizing yields in the northern frontier. I mean, having a bigger canopy earlier in the season could benefit us immensely. So breeding for those early season soybeans, early emergence, cold tolerance, you know, stress tolerance for moisture and things like that, I think could really benefit, especially the folks in the far north.
Okay, well, I think we're going to move on here to Sean. We had one more question, but Sean, you're going to address this in your presentation. And as you pull your presentation up, the question is there an absolute date, cutoff date, when you don't want to plant soybeans? And I know that's something that you're probably going to address. So, Dr. Conley, the floor is yours.
How about I unmute? That would help things. So I just want to make the quick comment that you notice over my right shoulder, you see artwork, and over Seth's right shoulder, you see a deer head. So you can kind of see the backgrounds we have are a little bit different into our houses. So I just want to make that quick comment if no one else picked up on it. So as we get in today, I want to talk a little bit about soybean planting considerations. And again, like Rachel did and like Seth did, we're kind of taking a higher level. You know, this is kind of a national type publication. Obviously, that's why it's important to have, you know, your county agents, the CCAs in there looking at fine tuning some of these, but we want to take a high level look at what we really see across the country in terms of the response to, in this case, planting date. So one of the things that we did, we were fortunate enough, is we got this project funded through the North Central Soybean Research Project. And there's basically a benchmarking of what farmers are actually doing. And we're trying to take a big data approach to collecting data. So some of the data that we've seen in this presentation and others come from this larger data set. And from this data, we had over 8,000 fields collected across the North Central region. And again, if you see each one of these red dots, that indicates where those samplings are taken. And this has data consists of over 600,000 acres. So again, we have a pretty good depth and breadth of data collected across this project that we're kind of dig into and help us frame the basis of these planting date recommendations that we see. And what did we find? Depending on where you are and what environment, growing environment we saw, we could see anywhere from a 0 to almost a 0.6 bushel per acre per day yield increase planting after that roughly April 20th planting date. Again, this is using not just our small plot data, but this is using the data collected from those 8,000 farm fields and over 600,000 acres. So I think it's a pretty robust data set that we can really see the differences across the North Central region. And again, we dig into the South here in a little bit to see the response to planting date in the South. So what we try to do, again, we try to maybe oversimplify it for the purposes of this publication, but we went state by state and tried to get an accurate estimate of what that percent yield loss would be from delaying planting date from May 1 to May 31st. And again, we start up here with North Dakota, and I saw Hans was on, so hi Hans, I'm glad you were able to make it. So between May 1st and May 31st in North Dakota, we saw almost a 23% reduction in yield. Okay, then we can kind of move over here to Pennsylvania. We see about 8% yield difference. So again, we see a huge range across the North Central, and then for this case, across the entire country, or at least the major soybean producing states across. And one of the cool things we're able to do too is we're able to pull out some data in Nebraska that we can look at the differences between a dryland operation and an irrigated. In Nebraska, the difference between May 1 and May 31st in a dryland situation was 27%, but then you get into an irrigated production, which I think about half of Nebraska is, or at least a good chunk, and that's a 42%. So again, there's a lot of differences across there. And I think one of the things that we noticed in collecting this data, and I think this really is amplified in the irrigated part, is it's that rainfill period, the rain deficit during seed fill is what's really driving this variability. Again, a good example here in Wisconsin this last year, what we saw is we saw record plantings. I mean, even our own program, we were done planting every single soybean plot we had by May 8th. Tremendous amount. And we were expecting to see record yields, and we were almost there. But we went through roughly a 3 to 6 week period in August and early September, depending where you are in the state of Wisconsin, where we didn't see a lick of rainfall. And in that situation, we went from an estimated record crop to, I would estimate, we lost 3 to 5 bushels off the top end. And again, that's where this response to this planting date effect is really driven by water availability during that seed fill period, and that's what really helps drive these different responses we see across the country. So again, I always like to call this free yield, and how does this free yield happen? And again, this is a very oversimplification of the process, but typically we would get in early, we get a quicker canopy development in order to shade that ground, save some of that moisture. But then we tend to see, again, on average, 2 to 3 extra nodes per plant, okay? And again, it doesn't always mean, and in fact, usually some of our earlier planted, at least in Wisconsin, this may differ across the nation. Some of our early planted beans are actually shorter than our late planted. We don't have such long internodes because we're really stacking them shorter internodes with more pods. And then this free math is pretty simple. Again, if we get 2 to 3 extra nodes per plant, 3 pods per node, average 3.3 seeds per pod, that's where we can come up with this free yield that, depending on where you are in the country, we can get up as many as 5 bushels per acre per day for every 10 days we plant earlier. So again, it's just free math. It didn't really cost you anything as a farmer just to get in there and plant earlier. And again, we put this up, and I don't want to overemphasize it, but I think it's important to know that it is free. It didn't cost you anything to get out there. There's no additional input costs, and just simple math, 5 extra bushels per acre at $12 November 21 beans, that adds up to $60 per acre to your bottom line. So I think that's something really to think about as we move forward into kind of pushing our planting dates if it's fit. And I want to make sure that as we get into talking about know your risks, we don't want you out there mudding your soybeans in. And that's not what we can do, because we can get sidewall compaction in soybean just as early. And if we go in and mud that soybean in, start out with a poor root system that's going to carry us through the growing season, it's just going to start us out behind the 8 ball. So again, when we're really looking at pushing these planting days, make sure the soil is fit, it's ready to plant, and then we can really try to maximize that yield potential from planting earlier. One of the early things we do see is as we see soybean cyst nematode increasing across and the interaction we see with sun death syndrome, we see the earlier planting risk for sun death syndrome. There are seed treatment options out there. Talk to your agronomist. Some of the newer ones on the marketplace do have good efficacy, and we can pair them with resistant genetics. We can really see a yield increase with these planting earlier to alleviate such as sun death syndrome here. And it was interesting, about 5-8 years ago, there was a recommendation out there by the extension plant pathologist that if you knew you had sun death syndrome in a field, one of the recommendations was actually to delay planting. And one of my former graduate students, David Marburger, actually dug into that. And we found, in fact, you're better off, planting earlier, even though you might get more disease pressure, than if you look at a whole field basis, that still better off planting earlier and not delaying planting to basically mitigate sun death syndrome as a strategy to reduce its overall yield effect on soybean. Another risk, if anyone paid attention to Twitter in this spring, we saw a lot of really early beans go in. We saw a big swath of frost damage where we lost stands across a large chunk of Illinois and parts of Iowa and Indiana. Well, a couple key points we want to make is, we've seen pretty effective that if you're planting early, I don't recommend that a farmer does anything to that stand until we get below 50,000 plants per acre. Okay. Seth had mentioned earlier that 100,000 would maximize yield. Done quite a bit of research looking at that range, and even down to 50,000, it's really not cost effective for a farmer to go out there and plant into those stands. And even if it's free seed, remember, you have to pay someone or yourself to go out there and physically plant those beans. It's going to cost you wear and tear in the equipment, fuel, and your time. I'd much rather recommend that farmers put an effective in-season over-the-top perimeter herbicide to help control water hemp. And then understand that even at down to 50,000 plants per acre, we tend to get full canopy. It just happens a week later. So again, that's kind of some of the recommendations we see. And again, if you look at this publication that will be emailed out to the group later on, we go state by state with recommendations. So some of my colleagues in the South don't agree with that, and that's fine. They have data to support what their findings are. So again, feel free to dig into the state by state recommendations that is more readily available in these publications. One of the key takeaways we say is we always try to ask farmers to check the RMA crop insurance date. This is a map that is in the publication. This is what we were able to find. Believe it or not, it was very difficult to find county-based RMA for the entire country. So there may be some errors in it. If there are, please let me know. We can obviously change those. But if we see, this is when we recommend farmers to start planting, is based on their RMA replant dates. So again, with that, I'm going to stop here. Here's the, Max, I know it's your turn.
No, this is the QR code. So if you've got a QR reader, you can scan that code. If you don't have that handy, as we've said earlier in chat, and just put your CCA number in chat, and we will get your CCA credit confirmed that way. So you've got both options. So we're going to look at some questions now. And
hey, Max, can I jump in one quick thing?
Yeah, sure.
Because I want to leave this up here for a couple minutes so people can get to it. So We had a farmer in Wisconsin decide to really test his planting date theory. So he planted his beans on December 10th, I believe. So we'll see. We have a nice thick layer of insulation. So I'm wondering to see how many of those plants will actually survive. And I'll take any bets. Seth, Rachel, what do you think we're going to see with those? I'm not going to go quite zero, but we'll see what we got there. So
You
all right,
guys got seed to burn over there, huh?
So my question, Sean, is what kind of cultures did he use to open that furrow?
well, the ground wasn't frozen yet,
No,
so I think he was just watching the weather, and
Sure.
he planted about 2.5, 3 inches deep, and then we got a nice snowfall on top of it. So it's always good to have some experiments out there.
Is it a
Well,
2020 or 2021 crop is the question.
That's a good question.
And it has to be a new first for a cold germ test, I would think. So, Sean, we got a question here. Is the 50,000 minimum plant stand also applicable when we have hail events later in the spring or early summer?
Well, I see that came from the beautiful state of Minnesota. So I see Dave Nicolai dropped that in there. So I'll just punt that over to Seth since that's his state.
It's my fault, huh? Yeah. So I think to just reemphasize Sean's point is it's the give and take between planting date and population is basically what we're talking about there. So if we have to replant, then we're giving up that any additional value we got from that early planting date. And so Sean's argument is a good one, is that keep that deficient stand because it's an early stand relative to rip it up and invest or even spike in a crop on the other side of it. So yeah, Dave is a partner in crime and we do a lot of hail adjusting or discussions before the hail adjusters are out. So this is oftentimes what we get is those early season hail questions, and farmers really want to get out there. The only thing I would add to this whole issue is that with herbicide resistant weeds, it's a whole new world out there dealing with these problems, is that it's very easy for us to make statements about maximum yield potentials based on these various dates, but farmers are the ones that have to deal with those deficient stands for the rest of the year. And if they've got weed problems that they can't battle, sometimes it's better scrapping and tilling and doing all that work and starting fresh relative to battling it if they've got some real problem weeds in those individual fields. So it's a different calculus than we dealt with 10 years ago for sure.
We got a question and it maybe harkens back to something that you had shared earlier, Rachel. The question is, why are the national foliar tests that you're looking at doing, why are they at R3? That might be too late of a time frame in some consultants' eyes. Any thoughts?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Max. So when our national team got together to decide what foliar fertilizers we were going to evaluate and the timing, we really used R3 as a timing that growers across the nation were often putting out fungicides and insecticides. So we assume that many of our producers wouldn't put out a foliar fertilizer on its own. They would likely co-apply it with some of these other pesticides. And so we chose R3 based on fungicide and insecticide timing. But I will say, when we release our extension materials on the best management practices related to foliar fertilization, we will also look at summaries of data that our colleagues have generated in studies outside of our study we've done over the past couple of years that will capture many different timings that the foliar fertilizer products were put out. So we'll have a comprehensive discussion on the best management practices related to that in our materials next year.
Very good, very good. And Sean, just a question I guess I had, as you look at earlier planting dates, maybe you could just touch on some of the different ways that you've seen, farmers kind of manage that equipment issue in terms of, there's a hesitancy or there's a temptation to get out and get corn done, and we can't think about beans until we get corn done. but you've seen it done a lot of different ways. Maybe you can speak to that.
Yeah, what I've really seen farmers really dig into this, when we see some of these, areas where we see a half a bushel to, up to 0.6 bushel per acre per day, farmers are really quick at math, and they can sort out, can I pay someone, to come in and plant my beans while I'm planting corn, or how many years would it take me to pay off me buying another planter and a tractor to get this done? So I think that's what we would do. Or in these situations where it's a lot less, 0.2, at that point, it's kind of a shakeoff, when you start versus when you start planting corn. So I think it's really dependent on the area you are and what that yield response is. Seth, Rachel, thoughts on that?
I would just throw out that the other side of that issue is around, again, risk management and working days. And I think it's easy to think about these as a linear progression of days to plant, but the reality is that farmers have windows that they can operate. And so the risk is not being able to plant tomorrow. The risk is not being able to plant for another week or 10 days. And so that's when those numbers that Sean's talking about get really big. And that's when farmers really start to look at the scale of their operations. And it's also why we see a lot of 120-foot wide planters out there pulled by big, huge tractors. So none of this is a mystery. I think it's all happening very naturally. Farmers understand this pretty well. And if for those folks that follow those USDA, weekly crop reports, and you saw the progression of planting like last spring, I mean, Iowa planted, I don't know, like 80% of its crop in 10 days or something like this last year. So farmers have the capacity now to plant very, very quickly. And so whether we've helped urge them along the way or whether they've figured it out, it's certainly for sure it's happening.
Okay, great. Well, we're kind of a little bit over our time here, but if there aren't any other questions, we're probably going to end things here. I'm not seeing anything more on chat.
Hey, Max, I was asked to throw up the QR code again. So I'm going to
sure.
that up here.
Yep, please do that. Yep, please do that. And then keep in mind, if you don't have a reader, just enter your CCA number in chat, like many of you have been doing, and we'll get your credit that way. So I'm just going to kind of close things out here. Just want to emphasize that make sure you go to the Soybean Research and Information Network website. There's a lot of great information there, as some of you probably already know, but the Science for Success has got a really nice presence there. There are some videos that Dr. Van and Dr. Nave and Dr. Connolly produced about the research that they just shared with you. And then we also mentioned these bulletins that are there for row spacing, plant population, and planting date. And there's a lot more detail in those bulletins regarding some of the research summary insights that Rachel and Seth and Connolly had shared here. And then finally, there's going to be a recording of this webinar that will be posted on the Soybean Research and Information Network as soon as that'll be able to go up. And I'm just going to check here before we close out to make sure there is no final question.
Max, I'd like to restate one quick thing. We threw this out at the beginning, but I want to restate it here, is that again, there was a number of extension agronomists joined in and helped put these publications together, and they weren't able to all be here, show their beautiful faces like Sean and I. I'm not going to include Rachel in that, but they were lurking out there in the ether. So I just want to urge everybody to support their local agronomist and soybean agronomist. I think there's a lot of good work happening, and this effort was certainly a large effort from a big group. So it wasn't just Rachel and Sean. There was other folks involved as well.
That's a great point, Seth. And that's one of the things that makes Science for Success unique and different and so valuable. And with that, we really thank everyone for joining us today. And we hope that you'll be able to continue to watch the next episode of Science for Success when we're able to share that with you. So on behalf of Rachel, Seth, Sean, myself, thanks for watching Science for Success. Have a good day.
Thank you, everybody.